Welcome back to another video. This video is on using loops in Python. So quick overview on loops. So loops allow you to execute a block of code multiple times without having to write the same code repeatedly. And this is useful for tasks that involve repetitive actions, such as iterating over a list, processing items in a collection, or performing operations until a certain condition is met. So by using loops, you can make your code more concise and easier to manage. And when you need to make changes to the repeated actions, you only have to modify the code inside the loop rather than altering multiple instances of the same code. And this reduces the risk of errors and makes the code base easier to maintain and debug. So loops are used for iterating over sequences or executing a block of code repeatedly. But there are two main types of loops you're able to use. One is the for loop and the other one is the while loop. So let's have a look at some use cases of the for loops and while loops. Some of the common examples of when you would use a for loop is when you want to iterate over a sequence, such as a string, list, or a tuple, or when you are iterating over a dictionary. And for loops are often used for when you need a range-based iteration, which is when you want to repeat something a certain number of times. Or another use case for for loops is when you want to iterate over multiple sequences simultaneously. For example, iterating over a couple of tuples, such as people's names and their ages. And of course, there will be other use cases for for loops, but these are the most common ones. Next, moving on to while loops. So this is another loop, and some of the reasons to using a while loop are, you would use a while loop when the number of iterations is not known and is dependent on a condition, like true or false, or when you need to wait for a specific condition to be true. Or another one is when you are reading input or processing data until a certain condition is met. So for example, to exit out of a program, you want to hit Q or quit. But until you hit Q or you type quit, it will always be false. And until you've met that condition of Q or quit, only then would you meet the condition. So that's one of many examples of why you would use while loops. And again, just like for loops, there will be other examples as well, but these are the common ones. So with the for loops, they are often preferred when you know the exact number of iterations you require. While the while loops, they are suitable when you need to continue iteration until a specific condition is met. So in this slide, I've got a very simple example of printing numbers from 1 to 10 without using a loop. And then on the right hand side or in the middle, we have a for loop, which shows how we do the same thing using a for loop. And we can see how many lines we save of writing the same code repeatedly. Now we can also do this using a while loop, and on the right hand side we can see that. But typically for this kind of scenario, the for loop is more concise for this kind of range-based iteration. But the while loop provides more flexibility in controlling the loop condition and incrementing the counter. So you can imagine more complex piece of code where you are repeating the same thing again and again. And you can imagine how large this could potentially get, whilst instead if you use a loop, you can save on many lines of code. So although we're going to go through some better examples in PyCharm, this is a very simplistic example of printing numbers from 1 to 10 without using a loop versus printing numbers from 1 to 10 using a for loop and a while loop. And we can see with the for loop, we specify a range from 1 to 11, so it generates a sequence of numbers starting from 1 up to but not including 11. Therefore it creates a sequence 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And we store this in our loop variable my_numbers, and then we print this to the screen. And for the while loop, we also store this in a variable called my_numbers, which equals 1, but we increment the value of 1, so my_numbers plus equals 1, and we make sure it does not exceed 10. So while my_numbers is less than or equal to 10, print my_numbers. And because we are incrementing my_numbers by 1 at a time, this will print our range of numbers from 1 to 10. So effectively it does the same thing. And moving on to the syntax for a for loop is, for variable in the sequence specified, execute the block of code. Now let's have a look at some examples of how we create for loops in PyCharm.
To start off with a simple example, we can use a string. A string is an iterable object because strings contain a sequence of characters. For example, for my string and the keyword in. So here we are going to print out my string using the for loop. So it's going to go through the sequence of characters and print everything within my string variable. So let's run the file. And it's printed out all the characters within my string. We can also use the range function with the for loop, and this will let you loop through a set of code a specified number of times. The range function returns a sequence of numbers starting from 0 by default, but we can change this, and it increments by 1 by default, but we can also change this as well, and ends at a specified number. So this is a very simple example saying using the command for loop, my underscore range in range 10. As we have the number 10 value in our range specified, this would print the values from 0 to 9. It excludes the 10, it's up until 10, so it excludes the 10. It starts from 0 by default and it increments by 1 by default. So it will print out 0 to 9. Let's run the file. And it's printed out the numbers 0 to 9. But we could also change it to start from a starting value, let's say 2, and we would need to specify a second parameter for this. So let's go with 21. So here we are saying print out 2 to 20. Let's run the file again, and it's printed out 2 to 20. But maybe we want to increment by 2, so we can do that as well by adding a third parameter. Let's print out by the increments of 2. So let's run the file again, and it should print out in increments of 2. And now we can see 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18, 20. So it's incremented by 2 each time. Or we can do 5. And now it's incrementing by 5. We can see it stopped at 17 because the next value would be 22, but we have told it to stop at 20. Well, 21, but it always stops at the number before. Let's have a look at another example of for loops, but let's use a list this time. Let's start off with a clean sheet again, and this time we will iterate through a list using the for loop. To start with, I will copy and paste my list. This is my list, so I've got some objects within the list. One which is an integer, a float 5.5, London, Marrakesh, true, so I'm using a boolean value here. Paris 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, blue, Ford, and that's it. So we've got 9 objects within the list, and the for, this is the keyword that initiates the loop. And then we've got the variable my underscore loop. This is the variable that takes on the value of each item in the sequence during each iteration of the loop. And then we've got the keyword in. This keyword is used to specify that you are iterating over the items in the sequence. Then we've got the sequence itself, which is my underscore list. And this is the collection of items you want to iterate through. This could be a list, tuple, string, dictionary, etc. And last but not least, we are printing my underscore list to the console. So let's run the file, and we can see here it's printed out my list. It's printed out the 9 objects. It's actually printed them out 9 times as well. One more example I wanted to show using the for loop, and this is using a previous example of creating VLANs. In the previous example we used the while loop to create the VLANs, but this time we are going to use the for loop instead. So I'm using the for keyword and the in keyword again, and our variable VLAN. The range function with 1 to 11 generates a sequence of numbers from 1 to 10. The for loop then iterates over each value in the range, and for each value it executes the block of code inside the loop. And this is the more cleaner and more concise way to iterate through a range of VLANs compared to using a while loop. You would typically, in a real world scenario, place your code over here. If you had APIs configured, so it understands your commands and so on. And then at the end, we would print out VLAN configuration complete. So let's run the file. And on the right, we can see it's created VLAN 1 to 10 and then exited the for loop with VLAN configuration complete. So those are 3 different ways we can use the for loop in Python.
And moving on to the syntax for while loops, and the syntax for a while loop is while expression is true, followed by colon, then execute the statement or block of statements. Now let's have a look at how we create while loops in PyCharm.
We are on PyCharm, and I'm going to show a couple of examples of how we would use while loops. And the first example is using a networking component, which is known as VLANs. You can see them as network interfaces, but more so they are logical network interfaces. They're technically known as logical subnets in your local area network. So this is my while loop example iterating through 10 VLANs. First we will create a variable VLAN equals 1, and then we will type the command of while for the while loop. While our expression VLAN is less greater than or equal to 10, colon, and this is where we specify our code. So we will start off by printing configuring VLAN and then the VLAN ID or the VLAN number. And below this we would typically configure the VLAN settings, but we are not going to do that here. In a real world scenario you would configure your APIs to configure the VLAN settings and so on, such as the VLAN name, the VLAN IP address, etc. And then at the bottom we would specify VLAN plus equals 1, which will move it to the next VLAN to configure the next VLAN and so on. And this loop will carry on until it gets to 10. So let's run the file, and here we can see it's configured VLANs 1 to 10. So here we specify while to initiate the while loop, and then our condition. So this is an expression that evaluates to either a true or false. So while the VLAN is less than or equal to 10, the loop will continue executing as long as this condition is true. So in this situation, we are fine because right at the bottom, we've got the VLAN plus equals 1, which moves the VLAN to the next VLAN until eventually it hits 10. So the loop will then stop. But you can have situations where there's no way of exiting the loop because you have user input, for example, and there's no way of stopping the loop until you specify a particular command or a keyword. We will have a look at that example next. Let's have a look at another example for while loops. First we will declare a variable with nothing inside it, and then we will start our while loop. So while feedback is not equal to leave, the variable feedback, and the variable feedback we will assign to an input, so it requires user input. How did you rate our services today? Poor, average or good? And then I will paste the rest of it in. And here what we are saying is if feedback equals poor, please let us know why so we can improve our services. Or if the user inputs average, again please let us know why so we can improve our services. But if the user specifies good, we appreciate the positive feedback. And if the user specifies leave, this will exit the loop and print out leave the feedback questionnaire. Maybe it should say leaving the feedback questionnaire. But for anything else, it will print out we did not understand your choice. Please choose between poor, average and good. Let's run the file. Let's drag it over a little bit so we can see the screen. How did you rate our services today? Poor, average or good? If we specify poor, and then it gives us the feedback. Let's go with average, good. And as we can see, it doesn't matter how many times we specify poor, average or good, it will carry on. Or if we specify anything else, it gives us the feedback of we did not understand your choice. Please choose between poor, average and good. Again, it's not going to leave the while loop until we specify leave. So finally, if I specify the leaving the feedback questionnaire, and then it exits the loop. So those are two examples of how we use while loops. And with the second example in particular, if you've noticed, we are using conditional statements with our while loops.